Dear students, we have so far seen excellently and effectively, in depth, thoroughly about seam strength in woven fabrics. You see, slowly we are improving. I am improving, and you are also improving because your listening skills are improving. I hope so. uh, Seams in knitted fabrics. Similarly, I will read. So there is one four paragraphs by Blackwood and Chamberlain, 1970, and after that, small testing method, and then we have a table, and then I think that will be enough, or otherwise, we will go for yarn slippage in woven fabrics. So, let's read seams in knitted fabrics. So, if you are online, it would have been better because, like Google Meet or something, then it would have been better. But I had to upload. So, when woven fabrics are seamed, the absolute seam strength is not in the major comma is not comma in the majority of cases comma of paramount importance comma providing it is reasonably high comma and it is accepted that comma with a seam efficiency of say 60 to 70% and in bracket seam efficiency is seam strength expressed as a percentage of the fabric breaking strength comma the seam will be commercially acceptable. Knitted fabrics are in general comma more extensible than woven fabrics comma and in some instances very much more extensible colon as a result it often happens that when a seam in a knitted fabric is extended along its length the extension limit of the sewing threads is reached before that of the fabric itself comma and the sewing threads that break at one or more points along the seam comma an effect known as seam cracking. Once a seam has cracked comma even at one point comma I am more stressing on commas. I will not read commas anymore. My mind is on commas. So comma ready. Comma ready is a city in our Sirisilla. So once a seam has cracked, even at one point, it is no longer useful, as the stitches will run back on either side of the break, and this will eventually lead to seam breakdown. Thus, the behavior of seams under longitudinal, in contrast to transverse stress, is of much greater importance in knitted structures than in woven ones. Under transverse stress, seams in knitted fabrics show both types of failure. breaks in which the sewing threads fail but the fabric remains intact, and in which the failure is in the fabric whilst the sewing threads survive. In a balanced seam, an extension of approximately 80 percentage is possible before the seam cracks. In a balanced seam, an extension of approximately 80% is possible before the seam cracks, provided the stitch rate is 20 or over. Reduction of the stitch rate reduces the extensibility, the effect being more pronounced for a cotton thread, than for a polyester thread. Other things being equal, the two thread chain stitch seam gives slightly higher extensibility than the lock stitch, though the difference is not so marked as is commonly supposed. Polyester thread gives the best result with an extension of just over 100% at 20 stitches per inch. Of the four variables, namely stitch rate, thread composition, thread denier, and seam structure, neither thread composition, nor thread denier is important from seam cracking point of view. The important variables are stitch rate and seam structure, with the sewing thread extensibility playing a minor part. So I will read one more time. If possible, I will read two more times because it is very interesting to read now for me, because I am trying to get into the subject. This is what we have to do. When we study, we should get into the subject. We should focus. I have focused, but there are some mind wanderings because of some problems. So, when woven fabrics are seamed, I will start from beginning. 5.6.2.2 Seams in knitted fabrics. The following points regarding the strength of seams in knitted fabrics are worthy to note. Blackwood and Chamberlain, 1970. When woven fabrics are seamed, the absolute seam strength is not in the majority of cases of paramount importance, providing it is reasonably high, and it is accepted that with a seam efficiency of 60 to 70%, the seam will be commercially acceptable. Knitted fabrics are in general more extensible than woven fabrics, and in some instances very much more extensible. As a result, it often happens that when a seam in a knitted fabric is extended along its length, the extension limit of the sewing threads is reached before that of the fabric itself. Knitted fabrics are in general more extensible than woven fabrics, and in some instances very much more extensible. As a result, it often happens that when a seam in a knitted fabric is extended along its length, the extension limit of the sewing threads is reached before that of the fabric itself, and the sewing threads that break at one or more points along the seam, an effect known as seam cracking. Once a seam has cracked even at one point, it is no longer useful, as the stitches will run back on either side of the break in a lock stitch, and this will eventually lead to seam breakdown. Thus, the behavior of seams under longitudinal, in contrast to transverse stress, is of much greater importance in knitted structures than in woven ones. Thus, the behavior of seams under longitudinal stress, in contrast to transverse stress, is of much greater importance in knitted structures than in woven ones. Under transverse stress, seams in knitted fabrics show both types of failures. Breaks in which the sewing threads fail, but the fabric remains intact, and in which the failure is in the fabric whilst the sewing threads survive. In a balanced seam, an extension of approximately 80% is possible before the seam cracks, provided the stitch rate is 20 or over. Reduction of the stitch rate reduces the extensibility. The effect being more pronounced for a cotton thread than for a polyester thread. Other things being equal, the two thread chain stitch seam gives slightly higher extensibility than the lock stitch, though the difference is not so marked as is commonly supposed. Polyester thread gives the best result with an extension of just over 100% at 20 stitches per inch. Of the four variables, namely stitch rate, thread composition, thread denier, and seam structure, neither thread composition nor thread denier is important from seam cracking point of view. The important variables are stitch rate and seam structure, with the sewing thread extensibility playing a minor part. Excellently said by Blackwood and Chamberlain. So, I will summarize what he said. When woven fabrics are seamed, seam strength with a seam efficiency of 60 to 70% is commercially viable. So with the woven fabrics, the seam strength need not be very high. It is okay if the seam efficiency of 60 to 70 percentage is there, and if it, then it is commercially acceptable. So next point, knitted fabrics are more extensible than woven fabrics. We all know that knitted fabrics are more extensible than woven fabrics. So this extensibility is very high. So when a knitted fabric is extended along its length, the extension limit is reached and then it breaks at one or more points. This is known as seam cracking. So seam cracking means the seam breakage after extensibility of the knitted fabrics, knitted structures. When a seam is cracked, it is no longer useful. And it will eventually break down. The seam will break down. Let us see this point here. Thus, the behavior of seams under longitudinal stress is of much greater importance in structures than in knitted structures than in woven ones. So in knitted structures, the behavior of seams under longitudinal stress is more important, is of much more importance. Under transverse stress, seams in knitted seams, not sims, I have read sims. Sim, you know what is sim? Cell phone sim, so that is different. This is seams. Under transverse stress, seams in knitted fabric show both types of failures. So under the transverse stress, sometimes seams break and sometimes fabric breaks under transverse stress. In a balanced seam, an extension of approximately 80% is possible. So, before a seam crack occurs, The knitted thread of balanced seam, the knitted structures will extend approximately to 80 percentage. So what does it mean? If the fabric is, if the course is 100 millimeters, then it will be extended to 180 millimeters, provided the stitch rate is 20 or over. So stitch rate should be more, it should be more, 20 or more. Reduction of the stitch rate reduces the extensibility. And this effect is more pronounced for a cotton thread than for a polyester thread. So, and other things being equal, the double chain stitch gives slightly more extensibility than the lock stitch. I am giving very nice summary. Please understand it. In the book it is there 2-thread chain stitch. So what is it? It is double chain stitch. I have shown you the video in the last class. Double chain stitch. Very good animated video. Of the 4 variables, there are 4 variables. What are the 4 variables? Stitch rate, thread composition, thread denier, and seam structure. So these are the 4 variables, and out of the important things are, out of the 4 variables, the important variables are stitch rate and seam structure. How? In the with reference to seam cracking point of view. So there are 4 variables: stitch rate, seam structure, thread denier, thread composition. Out of the 4 variables, stitch rate and seam structure are the 2 important things with reference to seam crack. With reference to seam crack. Here in the book it is said, I will read what is in the book now. Of the 4 variables, namely stitch rate, thread composition, thread denier, and seam structure, neither thread composition nor thread denier is important from seam cracking point of view. The important variables are stitch rate and seam structure, with the sewing thread extensibility playing a minor part. So what are the most important things for seam, not seam cracking not to happen for, so seam stitch rate and seam structure should be good. So we will complete. We have completed Blackwood and Chamberlain's 4 paragraphs. Now we will, it is very easy after this. Seam strength. So seam strength in knitted fabrics we are studying. So next paragraph, as told by Pradeep V. Mehta, our author. Seam strength in a knitted fabric can be tested in the same way as testing bursting strength, except that the test specimen should have a seam in the middle. It is customary to take at least 3 to 5 specimens to test, and the final test result is expressed as an average of the test results of these specimens in terms of grams per square centimeter. So seam strength of knitted fabrics can be found out in the similar way as the bursting strength, and except one fact is that there should be seam in the sample to be tested, and 5 samples should be taken, and the average of 5 samples will be found out. Table 5.1 shows some strength and stretchability test results for a particular style of ladies pantsuits using the concept proposed by Blackwood and Chamberlain. Seam stretchability and strength results were obtained by testing seams in a longitudinal direction using a constant rate of extension CRE machine such as an Instron tester. The first figure indicates the amount of force load in pounds to break the seam. Amount of force, I will read one more time. The first figure indicates the amount of force, that means load, in pounds to break the seam or sewing thread, and the second figure indicates seam elongation in percent of the original length at the seam break. So seam stretchability percentage at break. So Chamberlain and Blackwood studied seam stretchability and strength results. So side seam, armhole seam, shoulder seam, seat seam. Oh, the first figure indicates the amount of force. So I will show you this table. I will explain you because I will explain not the table but some English. The first figure indicates the amount of force in pounds to break the seam. So here if you study, so if you see, there is 12.5 and 28.5. So that is the amount of force is 12.5 and 28.5 is the seam elongation percentage. So Blackwood and Chamberlain has did all the things, and they found the seam stretchability percentage at break for side seam, armhole seam, shoulder seam, seat seam. Oh god. Okay. So the table is not that important for you. Now I will tell you some of the things that I have doubts. You see, this is very funny. Stitch rate. What is stitch rate? Stitch rate is the number of stitches per inch in the length of a carpet. Generally, so this is what, dear students, please understand what is stitch rate. Stitch rate is the number of stitches per inch. It is not the rate at which the stitches are built. Stitch rate is, that is the speed. So here stitch rate is, maybe I am the only one confused, or maybe the wording is different, or maybe, so rate, when you say rate it means speed, but here stitch rate is number of stitches per inch. Suppose if stitch rate is 20, then it means 20 stitches per inch. Suppose if stitch rate is 40, then it means number of stitches per inch are 40. So this is one thing I want to clarify to myself and to you also. So dear students, we have completed seam strength. Seam strength in woven fabrics, seam strength in knitted fabrics, and we have studied in comparatively, and why is he bothering me? These people who every time they ask me YouTube Premium. खरीदो. So obviously we have 5 more minutes and I will show you seam strength of knitted fabric. Seam strength in knitted fabric.
The seam properties of a garment made from woven fabric are determined by using a tensile testing machine, which is capable of applying a constant load at a constant rate of extension and recording the load at which a seam opens to a given amount and the final breakdown of the seam. Test specimens are prepared by cutting 5 specimens in the length, or and 5 in the width, weft directions from the sample provided. Seams are prepared using a specified sewing thread, style of needle, type of seam and seam allowances, and number of stitches per unit length.
I want to know about seam strength in knitting, not this. Okay, let's see this. This is non-woven fabric is similar to knitting fabric. So
need it in 10 minutes? Just Blinkit. Download the Blinkit app now.
So that is one kind of seam strength testing. So but seam strength in knitted fabrics is similar to bursting strength, but you have to get the seam in the sample. Thank you, dear students. Thank you very much.